Mark stood in his front yard, his fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the heat of the midday sun on his back, but it was nothing compared to the boiling anger inside him. The green grass underfoot felt like a symbol of everything he'd worked for, everything he'd fought for in this neighborhood. His small garden, carefully tended to over the years, had become his pride. Yet, it was now the center of his frustration. The HOA, or Homeowners Association, had been breathing down his neck for months. At first, it was small things. The mailbox wasn't the right color, or his trash cans weren't always put away in the approved location. Little rules that he didn't understand and certainly didn't agree with. But the final straw had been the garden, the one thing he truly cared about in this otherwise monotonous neighborhood. They had sent in a letter 2 weeks ago. It was polite, but cold. Remove the garden by the end of the month or face consequences. What consequences? Mark wondered. It was just a garden, flowers, a few vegetables, and a couple of shrubs. Nothing wild, nothing illegal, just a small slice of beauty in a world that often felt gray. Mark wasn't the type to back down, not when it came to his home. He had worked hard to make this place his own, and the HOA wasn't going to tell him how to live. But the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. The HOA had too much control over everyone's life, and now they were coming for his garden. This time, it wasn't just a letter. They had sent someone to knock on his door and remind him again. That was when Mark decided it was time for payback, time to show them that he wasn't going to sit back quietly anymore. The thought of revenge gave him a strange satisfaction. Mark wasn't one for violence, but the idea of making the HOA regret their decisions felt empowering. He would do something bold, something they wouldn't expect. As Mark paced around his yard, planning his next steps, he failed to notice the quiet, steady gaze of his neighbor, Vin Diesel, watching him from across the street. Vin had always been a bit of an enigma to the other residents of the neighborhood. He didn't fit the mold of the typical friendly neighbor. He was quiet, never really involved in any of the local events or gossip. He kept to himself, mostly, and yet, Mark had always been curious about him. There was something about Vin that felt off. It wasn't his appearance. Vin looked like any other man in his early 40s, strong and fit, with a face that carried the weight of experiences few could understand. But it was the way he carried himself, the way he always seemed to be watching. And now, as Mark's frustration grew, he caught Vin's eyes briefly through the window of his house. There was no expression on Vin's face, just calm, piercing eyes that seemed to observe everything without reacting. Mark didn't think much of it. To him, Vin was just another quiet neighbor. But Vin was more than that. Mark didn't know it yet, but the man who lived just a few houses down had a history that would make even the most seasoned criminals pause. Vin wasn't just a retired soldier. He was a special ops agent, a man who had faced situations that would break most people. His time in the service had taught him how to read people, how to sense danger before it ever happened. And right now, he could sense something in Mark's actions, something that didn't feel right. Vin's instincts told him that Mark was up to something. There was a restlessness in the air, a tension that hung between the two houses. He'd seen Mark get the letter from the HOA. He'd seen the rage building in him. And Vin had seen how Mark had started to act differently, more reckless, more determined. It wasn't just the garden anymore. It was bigger than that. Mark had crossed a line, and Vin could tell that the man wasn't planning to stop until he had caused some serious trouble. As Mark continued to plot his revenge, unaware of the man watching him from the other side of the street, he started taking small steps toward his goal. He knew the HOA was watching him, so he would give them something to watch. Maybe he'd start by throwing a wild party in his backyard, something loud and uninvited. That would be the perfect way to show the HOA they couldn't control him. Or maybe he'd put up a sign in his yard, declaring his defiance. Whatever it was going to be big. But just as he turned to head inside and make his plans, something stalked him. He felt it, a shiver down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He turned slowly, glancing across the street, but saw nothing. Vin's house was quiet, no movement. Still, the feeling lingered, like something was about to happen. that he wasn't prepared for. For the first time, Mark wondered if his plans were about to take a turn he wasn't ready for. The suspense hung in the air, thick and heavy. Mark had no idea what he was really up against, but Vin knew. He knew the storm Mark was about to create, and the question remained, how long would it take before Mark realized that his seemingly harmless acts of rebellion were about to provoke someone much more dangerous than he could ever imagine? Mark's anger simmered throughout the week. The more he thought about the HOA's demands, the more he became determined to get back at them. He was no longer thinking of small acts of defiance. He wanted to do something bold, something that would make the entire neighborhood sit up and take notice. One evening, after a long day of work, Mark stood in front of his house and surveyed the scene. His garden, once vibrant and full of life, now seemed like an empty battleground. The HOA's warning had taken away his sense of peace, but not for long. It was time to fight back. He marched to his garage and started pulling out materials, old paint cans, leftover signs from past projects, anything that could help him carry out his plan. His first step was simple. He needed to make sure the HOA knew he wasn't backing down. He decided to break the rules in the most public way possible. With a steady hand, Mark began painting his mailbox in an obnoxious neon green. It was the perfect color, bright, in your face, and completely against the HOA's approved color scheme. When he was done, he stood back and admired his work. This was just the beginning. Next, he decided to throw a party, a loud, rowdy party, something that would draw attention and force the HOA to confront him. He invited everyone in the neighborhood, whether they liked it or not. Mark wasn't about to be intimidated. He started spreading the word, telling people to show up and enjoy the night. As the evening of the party approached, Mark felt a surge of satisfaction. He was doing something the HOA could never ignore. They had controlled him for far too long, telling him what he could and couldn't do with his own property. Now it was his turn to take control. The party kicked off as planned. Music blared from large speakers in the backyard, the sound echoing down the street. People gathered in the yard, laughing, drinking, and having fun. Mark could hear the sounds of the neighborhood growing quieter as people stayed inside their homes, watching from their windows. It was exactly what he wanted. He was creating a spectacle, something that would force the HOA to take notice. But as the night wore on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the disapproving looks from the neighbors or the occasional glare from the HOA members who passed by. It was something deeper, something unsettling. At the edge of his property, near the street, he saw a shadow move across the window of his neighbor's house. Vin Diesel. The man was watching him again. Mark had noticed Vin's eyes before, always quiet, always calculating. But this time, there was something different. Mark could see Vin standing there, his figure just barely visible in the dim light. He was still, his gaze fixed directly on Mark. Mark couldn't help but feel a chill run through him. He had never really spoken to Vin, and though the man was often calm and collected, there was something intimidating about him. Maybe it was his silence, his ability to remain hidden in plain sight. Mark tried to ignore the feeling, but it gnawed at him. The party continued into the night, and as expected, the HOA showed up. A couple of their enforcers appeared at the edge of the yard, their arms crossed, standing as though they were waiting for the perfect moment to confront Mark. They didn't have to say anything, just their presence was enough. But Mark was ready. He marched up to them with a confident smirk on his face. "What's the problem?" he asked, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Isn't this what you wanted? People getting together, enjoying themselves?" One of the HOA enforcers, a tall woman named Mrs. Harding, stepped forward. "This isn't what we meant by community engagement, Mark," she said in her stern tone. "You've violated every rule we have, and it's time to face the consequences." Mark laughed, shaking his head. "Consequences? You think I'm afraid of you? I'm done with this. You can't control me anymore." The tension in the air grew thick as Mark and Mrs. Harding exchanged words. The crowd was silent now, watching, waiting for something to happen. The enforcers were about to take action when suddenly, there was a movement in the shadows. Vine stepped forward from the corner of the yard, his tall figure looming. He didn't say anything at first, just watching the scene unfold. But there was a quiet authority about him. Mark noticed how the atmosphere seemed to change the moment Vine appeared. People instinctively stepped back, as if they sensed something powerful behind his calm exterior. Mrs. Harding turned her attention to Vin, eyeing him warily. She recognized him from the neighborhood, but she had no idea who he really was. "And who are you?" she demanded. Vin didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his arms crossed, his gaze cold and unflinching. The room was silent, and Mark felt a bead of sweat form on the back of his neck. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain. Vin wasn't someone to be messed with. Finally, Vin spoke, his voice low and steady. "I think you should leave," he said to the enforcers. There was no hint of emotion, no anger in his tone, just a calm assurance that made the air feel even heavier. Mrs. Harding looked at him, confused and irritated. "You can't just." "I said leave," Vin repeated, his tone now sharp and final. The enforcers hesitated. There was something in Vin's presence that made them think twice, something that stopped them in their tracks. After a tense moment, they turned and walked away without another word, leaving Mark standing there, a mix of confusion and triumph on his face. Vin didn't say anything to Mark. He simply turned and walked back to his house, disappearing into the shadows once again. Mark stood there, staring after him, unsure of what had just happened. He had expected a victory, but what he got was something else, something that felt like a warning. For the first time, Mark realized that maybe his plan had just crossed a line he didn't fully understand, and Vin Diesel wasn't someone he wanted to mess with. The morning after the party, Mark woke up to the sound of birds chirping, a reminder that the world kept turning, despite the chaos he had created. He squinted at the sunlight pouring through his windows, his head throbbing from the loud music and the alcohol from the night before. But it wasn't the hangover that made his stomach turn. It was the events of the previous evening. Mark's victory felt hollow. Sure, he had stood up to the HOA, but there was something unsettling about Vin Diesel's interference. The way the enforcers had backed down without a fight, how everyone seemed to respect Vin's presence without question. It was all too much. Mark had underestimated him, and he knew it. He had planned for the HOA to feel the weight of his actions, but he never imagined that Vin would intervene. Now, the uneasy feeling in his gut only grew stronger. What had Vin been thinking when he stopped the confrontation? Why had he stepped in? Mark sat up, rubbing his temples, trying to clear his thoughts. He had to keep moving forward with his plan, didn't he? The HOA wasn't going to stop. They would keep coming at him, and he needed to make them back off for good. But in the back of his mind, a small voice was telling him that he had to be careful. That voice, however, wasn't loud enough to drown out his anger. He glanced at his phone, checking the messages he had received from the neighbors. Some were supportive, though they whispered about how things had gotten out of hand. Others were more direct, warning him that the HOA would escalate their efforts if he didn't back down. One message stood out. It was from a number he didn't recognize. "You've made a powerful enemy. Be careful. If you want to win this, you'll need more than just loud parties and rebellious signs. Talk to Vin Diesel. Trust me, he knows how to deal with people like the HOA." The message was short, but it hit hard. Mark didn't know what to think. Who was this person? Why did they think Vin could help? And most importantly, why would Vin want to get involved in his petty HOA war? Against his better judgment, Mark decided to do something he hadn't considered before. He needed answers. He needed to know more about the man who had, for some reason, stopped the HOA enforcers without a word. And if Vin really had the skills and knowledge to help him, maybe he should stop resisting and ask for help. That afternoon, Mark found himself standing in front of Vin's house. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. Mark hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach. Was this really a good idea? Would Vin even talk to him? But he had to try. He had no other choice. Vin's house was quiet, the curtains drawn, and the driveway empty. Mark knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the silence. For a moment, there was no response, and Mark began to think he had been foolish for even trying. Just as he was about to turn away, the door opened, and there stood Ven. "Can I help you?" Ven asked, his voice calm, but with an edge that made Mark nervous. Mark swallowed his unease and spoke up. I wanted to talk to you about what happened last night. The HOA. I'm not sure what to make of it, but you stepped in, and I need to understand why." Ven's expression didn't change. He didn't seem surprised, nor did he seem interested in small talk. "You don't want to mess with them, Mark. The HOA is just the beginning. People like them will stop at nothing to make sure they control everything around here. I've dealt with people like that before." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? You think they're dangerous?" Vin paused before answering. "No, not dangerous. Just persistent. They don't know when to stop. And when you push back, they push harder. That's how they work. It's all about control, and they have more power than you think." Mark felt a flicker of frustration. "So, what do I do? Do I just roll over and let them take my garden, my home, my life? That's what they want." "No." Vin's voice was firm. "You don't roll over. You fight. But you fight smart. And you don't go into it alone." Mark blinked. "What do you mean? Are you saying you'll help me?" Vin gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "If you want to win this war, you need more than just a garden. You need someone who knows how to deal with people who think they can control you. I've been in situations before where people like the HOA are just a distraction from the real fight. And I don't back down from a fight. If you're serious about winning, I'll help." Mark's heart raced as the weight of Vin's words settled in. He had expected resistance, maybe even some rejection. But what Vin was offering was something Mark hadn't considered. An ally who knew how to navigate battles far bigger than anything the HOA could throw at him. For a moment, Mark just stood there stunned. He had always thought of himself as someone who could handle his own problems. But now he realized that some battles required more than just a loud voice or rebellious signs. Some battles required real strategy, experience, and allies who understood the game. "Okay," Mark said, swallowing his pride. "I'll take the help. I don't want to back down, and I don't want to lose everything I've worked for." Vin stepped aside, motioning for Mark to come in. "Good. Let's start by taking a look at the bigger picture. The HOA doesn't just want to control your garden. They want to control everyone. And I've got a plan to make sure they learn a lesson they won't forget." As Mark stepped inside, he realized that what he had thought was just a petty neighborhood dispute was about to become something much bigger. And with Vin Diesel by his side, the HOA wouldn't know what hit them. The following morning, Mark sat across from Vin at his kitchen table. His mind was still reeling from the offer. He had spent days plotting revenge on the HOA, but he hadn't planned on finding an ally, especially not someone as mysterious and calm as Vin. Still, he couldn't deny that he needed help if he was going to win this fight. Vine laid out a simple plan on a piece of paper, his handwriting sharp and clear. It wasn't complicated, but it was calculated. Mark stared at the paper for a moment, trying to wrap his mind around it. It wasn't the kind of revenge he had envisioned, but maybe that was the point. "You've been doing everything you can to push back against the HOA, Vin said, tapping the paper. "But this isn't about winning little skirmishes. This is about taking away their power. The HOA doesn't just control the rules. They control the people." Mark nodded slowly. "So what do you want me to do?" Vin's eyes were steady, his voice calm as ever. "We're going to change the way the neighborhood sees the HOA. Right now, they think they can walk over you. We're going to show them that everyone's been under their thumb, and it's time for a change." Mark leaned in, intrigued. "How do we do that?" Vin slid a photo across the table. It was a picture of a large community meeting hall, the place where HOA decisions were made. "This is where they hold their meetings. We're going to crush their next one, but not with violence or chaos. We do it with numbers, with influence. We show the neighborhood that the HOA isn't as untouchable as they think." Mark's mind raced. "You want to organize a protest?" "No," Vin replied with a hint of a smile. "I want you to win over the people they control. We get the neighbors on our side. They may not be ready to confront the HOA yet, but once they see that they're not alone, things will change. Everyone has a breaking point, Mark, even the HOA." Mark felt the weight of what Vin was suggesting. It wasn't the kind of in-your-face revenge he had been planning. It was smarter. It was about playing the long game. But Mark had one question, something that had been bugging him since he first started dealing with the HOA. "And what about you, Vin? What's your story? Why are you helping me with this?" Vin didn't flinch. He looked straight into Mark's eyes, his expression unreadable. "I've been where you are, Mark. I've fought battles with bigger stakes than a garden or a lawnmower rule. The HOA is nothing compared to the fights I've had to face. But I know what it's like to be pushed around, to have your life dictated by people who don't understand you. I'm just giving you a chance to take control back." Mark stared at Vin for a long moment, trying to make sense of his words. He could see the truth in them, the depth behind Vin's calm demeanor. There was more to this man than met the eye. "All right," Mark said finally, after a deep breath. "Let's do this. We'll start with the neighbors. We'll show them that they don't have to be afraid anymore." Vin nodded, his lips curling into a slight smile. "Exactly. But it's not just about showing the HOA they can be beaten. It's about showing everyone around here that there's power in standing up. We'll take away their fear, one person at a time." Mark left Vin's house that day with a feeling of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. The anger from the previous days was still there, but it was now paired with a new sense of strategy. The fight wasn't going to be won with petty acts of defiance or loud protests. It was going to be won with calculated moves, with alliances, and with patience. That night, Mark went door to door, knocking on the neighbors' houses and speaking to anyone who would listen. He wasn't sure if they would support him, but he had to try. And to his surprise, people were starting to listen. One by one, they began to nod in agreement, some even offering their support. He wasn't alone in his frustrations. They all had their own stories of the HOA's overreach, their own rules that didn't make sense. By the time Mark had spoken to everyone he could, a small but determined group of neighbors had agreed to join him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Mark walked back to his house, he felt something he hadn't in a while: hope. Maybe this wasn't just about getting revenge on the HOA. Maybe it was about something bigger, a fight for fairness, for the right to live the way they wanted without constant interference. But deep down, Mark knew that this was just the beginning. The real battle would be at the HOA's meeting, where he and his neighbors would face the people who had controlled their lives for far too long. And with Vin Diesel at his side, he had a feeling that they just might have a shot at winning. The night before the HOA meeting, Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind was racing with thoughts of the plan that was about to unfold. He had gathered a small group of like-minded neighbors, each with their own grievances against the HOA. Tomorrow, they would make their stand. Vin had given him advice, clear and precise. Don't just make noise, make an impact. Mark wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew this wasn't just about his garden anymore. This was about showing everyone that they didn't have to live in fear of the HOA, that they could stand up for what was rightfully theirs. The night was quiet, but Mark couldn't find peace. His thoughts kept circling back to Vin. He had agreed to help, but Mark still didn't know the full extent of Vin's past, and that uncertainty left him uneasy. Was Vin really just a retired special ops agent who wanted to help a neighbor? Or was there more to his involvement than he was letting on? The next morning, Mark gathered the neighbors in his backyard. It was a crisp, clear day, the sun shining brightly as they stood around him, listening intently. There were about 15 people, each with a small piece of paper in their hands, notes of the injustices they had faced from the HOA. Some had been fined for trivial things, others had been forced to change things in their yards that didn't make sense. Mark could see the frustration in their eyes, the same frustration he had been feeling for months. "We've been fighting alone for too long," Mark began, his voice steady. "But today we fight together. This isn't just about one garden or one yard. It's about showing the HOA that they don't have the power to control us anymore. We stand united, and we won't let them walk all over us." The group nodded, some exchanging glances, while others clenched their fists in determination. Mark felt a surge of confidence. This was it. The plan they had discussed was simple but powerful. They would show up at the HOA meeting, not as individuals, but as a united front, ready to challenge the rules that had been forced upon them for far too long. As they made their way to the meeting hall, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The hall was busy, filled with people arriving for the monthly HOA meeting. The usual crowd of homeowners, all dressed in business attire, exchanged polite greetings. But today, the atmosphere was different. There was a quiet tension in the air, a sense that things were not going to go as they usually did. Vin was there, standing in the back of the room, calm and collected, his arms crossed over his chest. Mark had no idea how he had managed to get in without anyone noticing, but there he was, a silent force in the room. Mark took a deep breath and stepped forward with the group, his heart pounding. The HOA board members were seated at the front of the room, their eyes scanning the crowd as they prepared to begin the meeting. As they called the room to order, Mark and the neighbors took their seats in the front row. The HOA president, a sharp-faced woman named Carla, glanced over the room, her gaze lingering on Mark for a moment before she began speaking. "Thank you all for coming to today's meeting. As always, we have a lot to discuss. First on the agenda is the issue of property violations. Mark Thompson, your front yard garden is still in violation of HOA regulations. We've given you multiple warnings about this, and it's time to resolve this once and for all." Mark stood up, his hand shaking slightly. The room went silent as all eyes turned to him. He could feel the weight of the moment. This was his chance to take control, to show them that they couldn't push him around anymore. "Actually, Carla," Mark began, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside him, "I've come to talk about more than just my garden. I'm here to talk about all of us. We're tired of being bullied by the HOA. These rules, these fines, they don't make sense. And we're done standing by while you push us around." There was a murmur in the room, and Carla raised an eyebrow. She wasn't used to this kind of confrontation. Mark could see the surprise in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with her usual cold demeanor. "Mark," she said, trying to regain control of the situation, "you're out of line. We have rules for a reason, and you can't just ignore them because you don't like them. This is a community, and we all have to follow the same guidelines." But Mark wasn't backing down. "These aren't guidelines. These are arbitrary rules that benefit only you and the people who profit from them. The rest of us are just trying to live our lives. We don't need your approval to enjoy our homes." Carla's face tightened, and for a moment, Mark thought she was about to retaliate harshly. But just as she opened her mouth to speak, a voice cut through the tension. "That's right." Vin's calm voice rang out from the back of the room. All heads turned toward him, and for the first time, the crowd seemed to freeze. Vine didn't raise his voice, but his presence was impossible to ignore. "I've seen people like you, Carla," Vin continued, his tone even but firm. "People who think they can control others with rules that have no real purpose. I've dealt with enemies much worse than you, and I can tell you this, you won't win this fight. The people are tired of being pushed around, and this," he gestured to the group of neighbors beside Mark, "is only the beginning." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He had no idea how much Vin's words were affecting the others, but he could tell they were listening. Even the HOA board members looked unsettled. Carla struggled to find her voice, but the damage had already been done. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. The HOA wasn't the untouchable authority they once were. Mark could see the cracks forming, the beginning of something bigger than any of them had anticipated. The atmosphere in the meeting hall was electric with tension, a feeling Mark had never experienced before. The neighbors, once silent and intimidated, now stood united, their heads held high. Vin's words had planted a seed of doubt in the HOA members' minds, and they knew their usual tactics wouldn't work this time. Mark glanced around the room, his heart pounding. The faces of his neighbors were filled with anticipation. They weren't just here to defend his garden anymore. They were here to stand up for their rights, for their homes. They had become a force, a group that the HOA could no longer dismiss as just a collection of disgruntled residents. Carla, the HOA president, seemed rattled by the sudden shift in the room. She regained her composure, but there was a noticeable hesitation in her movements. She cleared her throat, trying to steady her voice. "Mark," she said, her eyes narrowing, You've made your point. But this isn't how things are done here. We have rules and we follow them. No one is above the regulations of the HOA, not even you. Mark stood tall, his voice unwavering. Carla, I don't care about your rules anymore. I care about fairness. I care about the people in this room who have had enough. You've been using these rules to control us for too long. But we're done being controlled. The room was quiet, everyone waiting for Carla's next move. Mark could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every neighbor who had been hurt by the HOA's unjust decisions. Carla's lips pressed into a tight line, but she said nothing. The silence stretched on, and the tension was almost unbearable. Mark looked to his side, where Vine stood, his arms crossed, watching the unfolding scene with an unreadable expression. He didn't say a word, but Mark could feel the strength emanating from him, like a calm storm waiting to strike. Then, out of nowhere, one of the other HOA board members, a younger man named Richard, stood up. His face was flushed with anger, his voice shaking with frustration. This is ridiculous. We've been following the rules for years, and now you're telling us they don't matter. This is how things are done in our neighborhood, and we're not about to let a few troublemakers change that. Mark didn't flinch. I'm not here to start trouble. I'm here to fix a system that's broken, and I'm not alone in this. Look around you, Richard. These people are tired of being silenced. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but Vin's voice cut through the noise, calm and authoritative. I've fought battles that most people couldn't even imagine. I've taken down enemies who would have never hesitated to destroy everything in their path. And I can tell you this, your rules don't scare me, and they don't scare these people. Richard froze, his eyes wide as he took in Vin's words. There was something in Vin's tone, something that commanded respect. The room fell silent again, the weight of his presence undeniable. Carla, who had been standing at the head of the table, finally spoke, her voice cold and calculated. So what do you want, Mark? What's your solution to all of this? Mark didn't hesitate. I want the HOA to stop using fear to control people. I want fair rules that don't target individuals or limit our freedom. And I want accountability. If we're going to live by your rules, then those rules need to be just. Otherwise, we're taking this fight further. Carla stared at him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing. You really think you can change things with just a handful of people? You're nothing without us. You'll never win this. Mark's heart beat louder in his chest, but he remained calm. Maybe we're small right now, but that's just the beginning. Once people see that they're not alone, they'll join us, and together, we'll take back what's ours. The room seemed to pulse with energy as the neighbors exchanged glances, their resolve growing stronger. They weren't just supporting Mark anymore. They were fighting for their own freedom, for the right to live without the constant overreach of the HOA. Vin took a step forward, his presence commanding the room once again. This isn't just about Mark. This is about everyone in this neighborhood who's been forced to follow rules that don't make sense. The power's not with you anymore, Carla. It's with the people. Carla's face turned pale, and for the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a stack of papers on the table, shuffling through them nervously. The fight that had once seemed so one-sided was now far from certain. Mark watched her carefully. He could see the cracks forming in her authority, and he knew this was the moment. They had to push forward. They had to keep the pressure on. I don't care if it's hard, Mark said, his voice steady. We're not backing down. We want change, and we'll do whatever it takes to make sure it happens. Carla finally stood, her back straight as she looked at the group. Fine, we'll give you a chance. But understand this, if you continue to push this, it won't end well for you. Mark met her gaze, his expression unflinching. We're ready for whatever comes next. The room buzzed with energy as the neighbors looked to each other, their resolve stronger than ever. The meeting ended with a sense of victory in the air, but the battle was far from over. Mark knew that the HOA wouldn't back down easily, and the real fight had only just begun. But with Vin's support and the unity of his neighbors, Mark finally felt that they had a chance. As the group left the meeting, Mark glanced at Vin, who gave him a small but knowing nod. They had made their stand, And now, they would see who truly held the power in the neighborhood. The HOA had underestimated them, but Mark was determined to show them just how wrong they were. The suspense lingered as they walked out, the battle lines drawn. It was only a matter of time before the HOA made their next move. But Mark, with Vin by his side, was ready for whatever came next.